And let's finish this chapter from Mary Poppins Comes Back. It's chapter 4. It's Topsy-Turvey. Everything in Mr. Turvey's house has gone topsy-turvy, including Miss Tarlett, his housekeeper, who is bouncing around like a balloon and is very happy. The only unhappy person appears to be the postman who has just come in. "Here!" he shouted, turning again. "Help! Help! Where am I? Who am I? What am I? I don't know at all. I'm lost. Oh, help!" But nobody helped him, and firmly held in Miss Tarlett's grasp, he was whirled on. "Always lived a quiet life, I have," he moaned. "Behaved like a decent citizen, too. Oh, what'll my wife say? And how shall I get home? Help! Fire! Thieves!" And making a great effort, he wrenched his hand violently from Miss Tarlett's. He dropped the letter into the cake tin and went wheeling out of the door and down the stairs, head over heels, crying loudly, "I'll have the law on them! I'll call the police! I'll speak to the Postmaster General!" His voice died away as he went bounding further down the stairs. Ping, 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 ping. The clock outside the square sounded 6. At the same time, Jane and Michael's feet came down to the floor with a thud, and they stood up, feeling rather giddy. Mary Poppins gracefully turned right side up, looking as smart and tidy as a figure in a shop window. The umbrella wheeled over and stood on its point. Mr. Turvey, with a great tossing of legs, scrambled to his feet. The hearts on the shelf stood still and steady, and no movement came from the shepherdess or the lion, or the gray flannel elephant or the toy sailor. To look at them, you would never have guessed that a moment before they had been dancing on their heads. Only Miss Tarlett went whirling on, round and round the room, head over feet, laughing happily and singing her song. "The whole of the town is upside down, upside down, upside down, upside down," she chanted joyfully. "Miss Tarlett! Miss Tarlett!" cried Mr. Turvey, running toward her, a strange light in his eyes. He took her arm as she wheeled past and held it tightly until she stood up with her feet beside him. "What did you say your name was?" said Mr. Turvey, panting with excitement. Miss Tarlett actually blushed. She looked at him shyly. "Why, Tarlett, sir. Topsy-Tarlett." Mr. Turvey took her hand. "Then will you marry me, Miss Tarlett, and be topsy-turvy? It would make up to me for so much. And you seem to have become so happy that perhaps you will be kind enough to overlook my second Mondays." "Overlook them, Mr. Turvey? Why, they will be my greatest treats," said Miss Tarlett. "I have seen the world upside down today, and I have got a new point of view. I assure you I shall look forward to the second Mondays all the month." She laughed shyly and gave Mr. Turvey her other hand, and Mr. Turvey, Jane, and Michael were glad to see laughed too. "It's off to 6 o'clock, so I suppose he can be himself again," whispered Michael to Jane. Jane did not answer. She was watching the mouse. It was no longer standing on its nose, but hurrying away to its hole with a large crumb of cake in its mouth. Mary Poppins picked up the Royal Dalton bowl and proceeded to wrap it up. "Pick up your handkerchiefs, please, and straighten your hats," she snapped. "And now," she took her umbrella and tucked her new bag under her arm. "Oh, we're not going yet, are we, Mary Poppins?" said Michael. "If you are in the habit of staying out all night, I am not," she remarked, pushing him toward the door. "Must you go, really?" said Mr. Turvey, but he seemed to be saying it out of mere politeness. He had eyes only for Miss Tarlett. But Miss Tarlett herself came up to them, smiling radiantly and tossing her curls. "Come again," she said, giving a hand to each of them. "Now do, Mr. Turvey and I." She looked down shyly and blushed. "We'll be in to tea every second Monday, won't we, Arthur?" "Well," said Mr. Turvey, "we'll be in if we're not out, I'm sure of that." And he laughed, and Jane and Michael laughed. And he and Miss Tarlett stood at the top of the stairs waving goodbye to Mary Poppins and the children. Miss Tarlett blushing happily, and Mr. Turvey holding Miss Tarlett's hand and looking very proud and pompous. "I didn't know it was as easy as that," said Michael to Jane as they splashed through the rain under Mary Poppins' umbrella. "What was?" said Jane. "Standing on my head. I shall practice it when I get home." "I wish we could have second Mondays," said Jane dreamily. "Get in, please," said Mary Poppins, shutting her umbrella. and pushing the children up the winding stairs of the bus. They sat together in the seat beside her, talking quietly about all that had happened that afternoon. Mary Poppins turned and glared at them. "It is rude to whisper," she said fiercely. "And sit up straight. You're not flour bags." They were quiet for a few minutes. Mary Poppins, half turning in her seat, watched them with angry eyes. "What a funny family you've got," Michael remarked to her, trying to make conversation. Her head went up with a jerk. "Funny? What do you mean, pray, funny?" "Well, odd, Mr. Turvey turning Catherine wheels and standing on his head." Mary Poppins stared at him as though she could not believe her ears. "Did I understand you to say," she began, speaking her words as though she were biting them, "that my cousin turned a Catherine wheel and stood on—" "But he did," protested Michael nervously. "We saw him." "On his head, a relation of mine on his head, and turning about like a firework on display." Mary Poppins hardly seemed able to repeat the dreadful statement. She glared at Michael. "Now this," she began, and he shrank back in terror from her wild, darting eyes. "This is the last straw. First you are impudent to me, and then you insult my relations. It would take very little more to make me give notice. So I warn you." And with that, she bounced round on her seat and sat with her back to them. And even from the back she looked angrier than they had ever seen her. Michael leaned forward. I apologize," he said. There was no answer from the front seat. There was no answer from the seat in front. "I'm sorry, Mary Poppins." "Humph! Very sorry." "And well you might be," she retorted, staring straight ahead of her. Michael leant toward Jane. "But it was true what I said, wasn't it?" he whispered. Jane shook her head and put her finger to her lips. She was staring at Mary Poppins' hat. And presently, when she was sure Mary Poppins was not looking, she pointed to the brim. There, gleaming in the black shiny straw, was a scattering of crumbs, yellow crumbs from a sponge cake, the kind of thing you would expect to find on the hat of a person who stood on their head to have tea. Michael gazed at the crumbs for a moment. Then he turned and nodded understandingly to Jane. They sat there, jogging up and down as the bus rumbled homewards. Mary Poppins' back, erect and angry, was like a silent warning. They dared not speak to her, but every time the bus turned a corner, they saw the crumbs turning Catherine wheels and shining on the shining brim of her hat. And that's the end of chapter 4.